Right now, somewhere in the world, there are industrial warehouses packed with machines, some the size of multiple massive storage facilities, burning through an absurd amount of electricity. And the only purpose of these machines is to solve math puzzles that serve no use on their own, except for one thing: validating transactions on a digital currency called Bitcoin. And this currency, even though it's just code, has at times represented over $2 trillion combined across all the units in existence. This is the insane story of Bitcoin, a story about an anonymous creator who vanished, fortunes locked away forever, billion-dollar scams, and a countrywide experiment that ended in retreat. And whether you've heard about Bitcoin every single day or never cared about it at all, this story affects you more than it seems. In early January 2009, in the middle of the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, someone created the first block of a network nobody had ever heard of. The author identified only as Satoshi Nakamoto. Nobody knew who they were. Nobody knew where they came from. And to this day, more than 15 years later, nobody has ever discovered their real identity. Months earlier, this same Satoshi had published a 9-page document describing Bitcoin, an electronic cash system that could be sent directly between people, with no need for banks or any central authority controlling the process. To most people at the time, this seemed completely irrelevant. Money with no bank behind it? No government? Who would even guarantee it had any value? But the timing couldn't have been more symbolic. Century-old banks were collapsing. Governments were bailing out financial institutions with taxpayer money, while ordinary people lost their jobs and homes. And buried inside the code of that very first Bitcoin block, Satoshi hid a message. The headline of a British newspaper from that day, about the government preparing for a second bank bailout. That wasn't a random detail. It was a statement of intent. For the first few months, almost nobody cared. A small group of programmers traded messages on obscure forums, mining Bitcoin on their own home computers. In practice, Bitcoin had no market value whatsoever. And it was in this setting that one of the most repeated and most painful episodes in Bitcoin history happened. In 2010, a programmer paid 10,000 Bitcoins for 2 pizzas. At the time, it was celebrated as proof that Bitcoin could actually be used to buy something in the real world. Years later, once Bitcoin's price exploded, those 10,000 units would end up worth hundreds of millions of dollars, making them, by far, the most expensive pizzas ever purchased. That funny story hides something much more serious. Over the following years, an enormous amount of Bitcoin was lost forever, thrown away on old hard drives, or locked behind passwords nobody could ever remember again. Independent estimates suggest that around 3.7 million Bitcoins, nearly a fifth of the entire supply that will ever exist, are now considered permanently unreachable. While Bitcoin quietly grew, its first major chapter of controversy emerged: Silk Road, a dark web marketplace where you could buy almost anything illegal using Bitcoin as currency. For the first time, Bitcoin had real, large-scale use. And along with that, it picked up a reputation that would follow it for years: the idea that Bitcoin was criminal money. In 2013, U.S. authorities identified and arrested the person behind Silk Road, who was sentenced to multiple life sentences in prison in the United States. But if you think that was the craziest story involving lost Bitcoins, just wait. In February 2014, the world's largest Bitcoin exchange at the time, called Mt. Gox, based in Japan, announced it had lost approximately 850,000 bitcoins, valued at around $450 million at the time of the announcement. Today, that same amount of Bitcoin would be worth more than $60 billion. Thousands of people lost access to their life savings overnight. The exchange collapsed, filed for bankruptcy, and its founder was even arrested in Japan over charges related to the case. This collapse nearly killed Bitcoin for good. A lot of people declared, "See, I told you this was all a scam." And yet Bitcoin survived. And this is where the story falls into a pattern that would repeat itself over and over. The price shoots up to absurd levels, attracts a massive wave of attention and new investors, then crashes hard, with headlines declaring Bitcoin dead, and then, quietly, climbs back up again, higher than before. But behind these price roller coasters, something much deeper was happening. Major companies, investment funds, and even entire governments started entering the market. And this brings us to one of the most bizarre chapters of this entire story. In September 2021, El Salvador became the first country in the world to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender, alongside the US dollar, after a vote in its legislature. The government even built up Bitcoin reserves and started mining the currency using geothermal energy from volcanoes. But the rollout was extremely turbulent. The International Monetary Fund repeatedly warned that using Bitcoin as official currency carried significant risks for consumer protection, financial integrity, and the country's financial stability. Reports showed that, years after adoption, the vast majority of Salvadorans still weren't using Bitcoin in their daily lives. And in 2025, as part of a $1.4 billion loan agreement with the IMF, El Salvador backed off. Businesses were no longer required to accept Bitcoin, and it became optional instead. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, China, which for years accounted for a large share of all Bitcoin mining on the planet, completely banned cryptocurrency mining and trading in 2021, forcing companies to rapidly relocate billions of dollars worth of equipment to other countries. But maybe the craziest part of this whole story isn't about Bitcoin itself, it's about the people around it. There's the story of James Howells, a man from Newport, Wales, who in 2013 accidentally threw away a hard drive containing the access keys to 8,000 Bitcoins. Years later, as Bitcoin's value skyrocketed, he tried, unsuccessfully, to convince the local city council to let him excavate the landfill where the drive supposedly ended up, eventually taking the case to court. In January 2025, a judge at the UK's High Court threw out the case, ruling there was no realistic prospect of success, citing both the likely physical degradation of the drive and legal issues around the time limit for filing the claim. The amount in dispute was estimated at nearly £600 million. There's also the story of Stefan Thomas, a programmer who received 7,002 bitcoins in 2011 as payment for a job. He stored the access keys on a highly secure encrypted USB drive, which allows only 10 password attempts before permanently wiping everything. Thomas forgot the password. He's already used 8 of his 10 allowed attempts. Depending on Bitcoin's price, that amount has been worth more than $800 million at times, and it remains locked, unsolved to this day. And then there's the question that still haunts the entire crypto community. Who really is Satoshi Nakamoto? Over the years, several people have been linked to the Satoshi identity. The most famous case was Craig Wright, an Australian computer scientist who spent years publicly claiming, including in multiple lawsuits, that he was Satoshi Nakamoto. In May 2024, a UK court issued a ruling spanning more than 200 pages, concluding that Wright had repeatedly lied to the court and forged documents on a grand scale to support that claim. The judge stated there was overwhelming evidence that Wright was neither the author of the Bitcoin white paper nor the person behind the Satoshi pseudonym between 2008 and 2011. Wright was later ordered by the court to post a statement on his own website admitting he is not the creator of Bitcoin. But Satoshi's real identity remains an unsolved mystery. And the wallet associated with the very first blocks mined in early 2009 has never moved a single Satoshi, the smallest unit of Bitcoin, since then. It just sits there, untouched, watching everything its creation has become. Today, Bitcoin has been through countless death announcements over more than 15 years. Every brutal price crash brought a new wave of voices saying it was finally over. And yet, it keeps existing, keeps being traded, keeps being debated in parliaments, and keeps generating both fierce devotion and deep distrust. The big question that remains is this: is Bitcoin the future of money, a massive bubble waiting for the right moment to pop? Or maybe both, depending entirely on when exactly you decided to pay attention to this story. And if you think this saga has already been crazy enough, just wait until you hear about the coins that came after Bitcoin, each one promising to be the next big revolution. and ending up in some of the biggest financial scandals in recent history. That's a story for another video.